I'm Mamta Nangya, PGT Psychology. Today, we are going to take up Chapter 5 of Class 12th, Therapeutic Approaches. This chapter carries 7 marks weightage. In the last chapter, we had talked about the various psychological disorders. In this chapter, we are going to talk about the treatment methodologies to handle those disorders. Now, therapy is differentiated from counseling in the form of adjustment, daily life issues, whereas therapy deals with the treatment modalities for handling the disorders. So, if the problem is more than the general adjustment, the daily adjustment, we handle it with therapy. So, psychotherapy is a voluntary relationship, it is an interactional relationship, a procedure, a treatment methodology between the one who is seeking treatment, that is the client, and the one who treats, that is a trained therapist. Now, the therapist is very proficient and has been under supervision for helping him develop various skills and helping him use various approaches. Now, therapy has a purpose, which is to help the client change the problematic behaviors, change the thoughts and the emotions for better functioning. We move on to the characteristics of therapeutic approaches. The first characteristic is systematic application of principles underlying different theories of therapy. So, it's a very scientific procedure. It is a very step-by-step procedure where the theory is applied in the practical life to help the patient recover. Second feature is the therapist should be practically trained under expert supervision. Third, the client is the focus of attention in a therapeutic relationship. Now, all the focus is on the client because the client is facing some problem. It could be problem related to his growth. It could be lack of self-awareness, it could be emotional pressures, it could be any kind of psychological distress or a major psychological disorder. So, the focus is on the client's improvement so that when he comes for therapy, he goes back and is able to handle his own issues better. Next feature is therapeutic relationship is very confidential. The trust factor is very important here because if the client trusts the therapist, that he will not disclose any personal issues, he will not make it public, only then the client will go for therapy in a very trustful manner and can share and confide conveniently and comfortably without hiding anything. So, therapeutic relationship is confidential, it's interpersonal, and it is a very changing relationship, a very dynamic relationship. So, here we are focusing again and again on the client, the therapist, and the psychotherapeutic relationship. This relationship is healing in itself. It is very important for building trust in the client, and it is very important for the client to accept himself. It gives the platform for the client to accept himself and deal with the issues in a positive manner. It also has certain aims. So, psychotherapy has certain aims, the purpose, the benefit based on different psychotherapeutic approaches. Now, when we do this particular chapter, link it with chapter 2 where we have done different approaches to understanding a human being. Those same approaches and the same psychologists, their principles are now applied in the treatment modalities. So, the aims or the purpose of psychotherapy is it reinforces the client's resolve for personal growth. This is basically a humanistic perspective which focuses on the client and his growth. It also reduces emotional pressure. It also helps in understanding a client's thoughts, modifying them to make it more adaptive and realistic. It also changes the thinking pattern, helps a client develop more interpersonal skills, better communication, good self-awareness, and also facilitates decision making and gives the power to the client to make better choices in life in a creative and self-aware manner. We move on to the components of this psychotherapeutic relationship because this relationship is very important for healing of the client. This relationship has certain components, and this is basically taken from humanistic perspective, although there are some general features also which talk about the contractual nature of this therapy. This therapy is where the client and the therapist are entering into a partnership for overcoming the problems of the client. It has a limited duration, it cannot go on forever, otherwise the client will develop a dependency on the therapist. So, the client only is empowered by the therapist who is able to give the power to the client, who is able to handle his own feelings, and once he learns the process, once he is empowered, he can go back and use it in his own real life. Now, let's understand the properties of psychotherapeutic relationship. The first property is unconditional positive regard. Now, as the term suggests, Unconditional means without any terms and conditions attached. No matter what the client says or shares, no matter how the client behaves, he is respected and regarded as a human being. The acceptance is very important. Only then the client will be able to unburden himself emotionally. This acceptance is very warm. It is giving a regard to a human being no matter what he shares and the way he shares it. So unconditionally accepting the client for what he or she is. Second feature, which is very important again, is empathy. Let's understand the difference between empathy and sympathy. Sympathy is more of pity. It is more of giving, let's say, a kind of a consideration to the other person, where you are showing a lot of pity to the other person. That is sympathy. Whereas empathy is more empowering, it is more healing, because it means understanding things from the client's perspective. We may not have gone through that problem as a therapist, but we know what the client feels. So getting into the shoes of the other person, the way he is feeling, he or she is feeling it, is known as empathy. It boosts the healing completely. It is also a professional relationship. That is why we keep talking about the aspect of confidentiality, that the privacy of the client's feelings and experiences are very important. It should not be made public. It should not be shared with anybody. Then we move on to the classification of therapies. Now let's understand that all the different kinds of psychotherapies are based on the different psychological approaches we have done. So let's understand them over 6 points, and let's get a comparative analysis of all the different therapies. The first therapy we have is the psychodynamic therapy. Now, psychodynamic therapy, we'll understand it from the parameters. There are 6 parameters. Then we'll move on to the behavioral therapy along with the cognitive therapy, and then the humanistic cognitive. The first parameter here is what is the cause of the problem? Why does the problem exist according to these 3 approaches? So psychodynamic perspective talks about the intrapsychic conflicts, the conflicts in the psyche of a person which result in distress and therefore result in disorder. If we come to behavioral therapy, it is primarily talking about the faulty learning mechanisms, the faulty behaviors, and the faulty thought pattern or cognition, the thinking, which is a part of cognitive perspective. Humanistic perspective and existential perspective talks about the tendency that a person is stuck up, is not able to grow. So the cause of the problem is the fact that he questions his own existence, the meaning of his life. That is the cause, the nature of the cause why a particular problem exists. Now, where has this cause come from? What is the origin of this cause is the second parameter on which we'll compare the 3 theories and the 3 therapies respectively. So, origin of the problem, the cause. Why does psychodynamic therapy talk about the intrapsychic conflicts? Where has it originated from? So, Freud talks about the childhood experiences, the unfulfilled childhood desires and wishes, which have resulted in the intrapsychic conflict. Similarly, for the behavioral and cognitive perspective, the therapist talks about the faulty conditioning pattern. The conditioning which has been established has resulted in the faulty behaviors. We move on to the cognitive perspective, which talks about the faulty thought patterns, the belief system, which result in the irrational thinking. We move on to the third perspective, which is humanistic existential. The reason why a person is looking for existential questions is because he is feeling lonely, he is having alienation, he is having existential anxiety. That is the second parameter for all the 3 approaches. The third parameter talks about the chief method of treatment. So when we talk about the therapy as such, this is the third point which deals with it. The psychodynamic uses mainly the approach of dream interpretation and free association, which we'll talk about later in detail. Then we also have the behavior and cognitive perspective, where the basic aim is to change a maladaptive behavior into an adaptive behavior. So obviously identifying the faulty patterns of behavior is important for behaviorism. Similarly for cognitive, identifying the illogical thoughts and therefore changing them into more logical thoughts. Then humanistic existential talks about more of a relationship between the client and the therapist. That is very important from the humanistic point of view, because they focus primarily on what we've just done about the components of therapy, which is unconditional positive regard, the concept of empathy. That is very important because humanists believe that if a human is given regard for the kind of person he is, he or she will accept his own self and therefore the growth will start. because most of the time in society, people are not accepted the way they are. They're always wanting to change people into something that others want them to. Therefore, it is very important to accept the person as he or she is, and therefore when the person is his own natural self, his tendencies to grow and self-actualizing will start. The fourth parameter to compare the three approaches is the kind of therapeutic relationship. Having understood the kind of treatment modality, we also need to understand the role of the client and the role of the therapist in all the three approaches. So for a psychodynamic approach, the power is entirely with the therapist. The responsibility for treatment is entirely with the therapist, because the therapist knows the treatment modality in a lot greater detail and doesn't really share it. He only is able to identify the symptoms and the deeper unconscious processes. So the treatment relationship is very, very direct, is very, very approachable, where the therapist identifies the intrapsychic conflicts and then tries to integrate them into the conscious personality of the person. Second approach, which is the behavioral approach, talks about again the faulty patterns of thought and the faulty patterns of behavior. So here the therapist is playing a role along with the client. He empowers the client, shares the techniques and teaches the client. So a lot of role plays are involved, a lot of exercises are involved, where the client learns the behavior modification from the therapist and is able to use it in the daily life. The third approach, humanistic approach, again talks about the psychotherapeutic relationship, which is a very secure relationship where the client is able to explore his own problems in a natural manner because of the warmth that the therapist provides or the security that the therapist provides. Next parameter, the fifth parameter, talks about what is the benefit of therapy for all the three approaches. What does the client get from the therapy in all the three different perspectives? So for psychodynamic, he or she understands or gets an insight into the emotional problems, into the intrapsychic conflicts, and once the client becomes aware of the issues which are there in his psyche, the conflicts which are there in his psyche, he is able to integrate them better and again doesn't need any past conflicts to be carried forward to the future because he can deal with them in a better manner. So self-awareness again is a very important aspect of psychodynamic relationship along with resolving the intrapsychic conflict. That's the major benefit. For behaviorist and cognitive, the behavior modification including the thoughts, because behaviorism talks about the behavior, cognition talks about the thoughts. So the major changes in the personality of the person from the thoughts, the feelings and the behaviors. So behavior patterns are changed, better decision making the person is able to do, better goal setting the person is able to do, therefore better adjustment in life. Humanistic existential definitely deals with person's growth, a better self-awareness, understanding of the person. In fact, his feelings, his thoughts, his or her motives are better understood in the secure relationship that the therapist and the client share. Now, last parameter is the duration of treatment. Duration of treatment here for psychodynamic has been quite a lot, but now with recent changes, psychodynamic has also been summarized to a very short duration. Although initially it was a number of years that psychodynamic modality used to take, but now it's relatively lesser. It used to be in 1 week, 2-3 sessions per hour. So it was quite extensive, it is quite exhaustive. Again, different psychodynamic perspectives talk about different duration of therapy, but by and large the time has reduced from what it was at the time of Freud. Humanistic existential and behaviorist cognitive, they are relatively more direct, they are relatively going to take lesser time and going to give better results immediately. So the results and the changes in the client can be seen quite quickly. Let's understand the steps in formulation of the client's problem. Now, when we talk about the steps, basically to understand the client's problem, what he's going through, and then to deal with it, it has to be done in a very systematic and step-by-step fashion. Therefore, the first step in understanding the client's problem is the basic idea about what the client is facing. That's very important. And once that is understood, the problem areas are identified, where does the client really need help, formulating a treatment plan, and then working out that treatment plan, implementing those therapies, and then follow up in the sense that maybe some techniques did not work very well for the client. Therefore, the therapist is very flexible in the use of techniques and uses them according to the need and keeps changing according to the growth of the client and the problem resolution of the client. Now here, this clinical formulation or the steps in the formulation of client's problem is an ongoing process because it keeps changing based on the clinical insights that the client and the therapist gain into the process. Now here let's also understand the concept of counseling and the concept of Zen, which have also been added as a supplementary material to the textbook. Now the concept of Zen is very important from the Buddhist point of view. That is a kind of meditation, a kind of self-contemplation. It's a technique and it's a proper procedure where the person goes in meditation as well as does a lot of spiritual text reading, where the person gets into the process of reflection and understands his own issues better, and therefore is able to deal with others also. There's a concept which is known in Zen Buddhist as Zazen, which means spiritual awakening. So this spiritual awakening happens once the person is with his own self and is with his own thoughts in the process of spiritual growth, which is more of meditation, self-reflection, self-contemplation, and the experiential wisdom. He's exploring his own self, dissolving his own conflicts. So we can say in a way that it's more of a religious perspective, it's more of an alternative therapy which helps a person get insight into his or her own self. Now, related to this is also the concept of counseling, which we started understanding with therapy. Counseling is also a voluntary relationship. It is a growth process, interactional process, motivational process, where the person understands himself better and is able to adjust with life issues better, is able to handle his own life better. Now here, how do we know, is it really counseling or something else? Is counseling an advice that is given? But counseling as such, which is normally considered as advice, is not really an advice given to somebody else. Advice can be given by anybody, a relative can advise. So how is a counselor different from normal relative? A counselor is different because a client wants to go to the counselor to share the problems. The counselor is non-judgmental, doesn't really pass on comments about why you have done this or you should not have done this. No moral grounds are laid down here. Therefore, the client is more comfortable in speaking out his own thoughts, and with that understands his problem in a greater detail. So voluntary relationship is one feature, along with which this relationship is where both of them sit together and lay common grounds of understanding. The client is willing to share issues with the counselor. The client is willing to go and get help from the counselor. These are some aspects which help us understand that is it really counseling happening or a general advice session. Thus, counseling is a very warm, accepting relationship, voluntary relationship which helps one understand themselves better. Today we have covered the meaning of psychotherapy, the nature, the approaches, the different approaches and the aims of psychotherapy along with counseling and the concept of Zen. That's about it for today. Thank you.